So if you don't know about Ashley, she's the senior historian and curator of social history at the New York State Museum. Her research and collections work primarily focus on women's history, especially the history of the fight for women's rights, LGBTQ history, immigration, and religion, as well as collection areas of sculptures, toys, glassware, and ceramics. And her first book, Breathing Life into Stone, The Sculpture of Henry DiSpirito, was published in 2013 and tells the story of DiSpirito's direct carving in stone and wood and his immigration into Utica. Thanks for being here, and I hope you enjoy today's program.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on this very miserable day, although I'm sure you're glad to have something fun to do that's inside since we don't have the sun today. So just to give you a little bit of background, first I'll mention that the New York State Museum is in Albany, New York. We're at the south end of the Empire State Plaza, and we have an ongoing Henry DiSpirito exhibition. So if you'd like to see some more works in person, I do invite you to come down, and at the end of the lecture I do have kind of a snippet of that. Also, if any of you are teachers or have family who are teachers, we have a lot of online materials for teachers because we are part of the state ed department, and we have 2 lesson plans on Henry DiSpirito, one focused on his immigration story and one focused on direct carving, and it's a more of an art-based lesson plan. So I encourage you to check those out as well. So I got started working with the DiSpirito family and working on Henry DiSpirito's story when I was a graduate student. I was thinking about my thesis topic, potential thesis topics, and in addition to a number of his works that had recently been given to the Fenimore Art Museum and exhibited there, his papers had just arrived in the archives. And they needed someone to dig into them to start to put together the story, and eventually that is what became the book. So I was so glad to get to meet the family and to work with them and really dig into this story. His works are inspired by his birthplace of Castelforte, Italy, and also here, his adopted home of Utica. And they reached a national art audience, as well as very diverse local audiences, including many usually forgotten by the visual arts world. So we'll dig into all of that. First, a bit about Henry DiSpirito's primary working style, and that which he is most known for, which is direct carving of stone. This was a tradition that was established in America in the 1920s. And here you can see 3 other artists that were really known for this style, contemporaries of Henry DiSpirito. Robert Laurent was also an immigrant. He came from France. William Zorak, again, an immigrant story, and he came from Lithuania. And then John B. Flanagan. And I would say that Flanagan's works are probably the most similar to Henry DiSpirito's. He was very fond of working in the medium of fieldstone and finding pieces from which to discover the images within. There's no evidence that Henry DiSpirito ever met any of these 3 men or that he got to see them, but certainly they were working in conjunction with each other. There's a visual repertoire that is shared with them. So as I mentioned, Henry DiSpirito was born in Castelforte, Italy in 1898 as Erasmo DiSpirito to Anna Riccardi and Giuseppe DiSpirito. Anna was a farmer and his father was a stonemason. And he left the 4th grade to become an apprentice to his father. At the same time, he had a dream of becoming an artist, and he was inspired by the beauty of the natural world, but he felt a duty to his family to work as a stonemason. The work that you see here, the water carrier from the New York State Museum collection, is one of several examples that we'll see really inspired by the visual heritage that he was remembering from his birthplace. He did continue to paint even though he was an apprentice stonemason, and he was given a chance to exhibit his paintings by a local hotel and restaurant owner, Antonio Coletta. And from there, his works were seen by Carmine Fusco, a visiting painter, who then offered to take him on as an apprentice. But his work as an artist in his early life was cut short by being called into service during World War I. He had an office position, but he saw the horrors of war and felt greatly affected by the pain and the suffering that he witnessed. These themes of the bad qualities of war, the pain, the suffering, also appear numerous times in his work. Here we see the pain of war from the Utica College collection, and After the Battle from the Fenimore Art Museum. He said that after the battle, no one wins, as you can see in the sculpture. And he also wrote that art is for humanity, not just for a few on this earth. If instead of a gun or toy soldiers, every child were given a brush, molding clay, or a sculptor's tool, this would be a happier world, the kind of world it was intended to be. I am going to jump around just a little bit before we talk about him actually coming to the United States. But a very recent find in my archival work is his World War II registration card for the draft. So I just like to think about what this was like as someone who served in World War I, who was greatly impacted by the horrors of war, to come to his new country and then have to fill out the draft card, and thankfully not be called, but just what that meant as a new American to think about potentially going into battle again, or near battle at least. And he carried the theme through in this lino cut as well, the end of fascism, man destroying a swastika, which is in our collection. The family talks about how important it was for him to complete this piece, to get this imagery out in a visual way. We have only the lino cut. We don't have a print that was made from it, but thankfully we were able to work with the Calandra Institute to get this kind of virtual digital print to really get a better sense of what this should look like. He came out of military service in Italy in October of 1920, and in his memoirs he wrote, "Returning home, there was little, primarily bread. The populace lived mostly in squalid poverty. In northern Italy, there were violent strikes. The workers occupied factories that could not sustain them because of the lack of prime materials. Italy, after the war, lived in a state of violence. Mussolini seemed to be going forward toward a dictatorship, and it was then that I thought to immigrate." On March 18th, 1921, he left Italy and had plans of joining his uncle and his cousin in Utica, and arrived in New York City on April 1st, 1921. Upon his arrival, he was renamed Henry, a fact that his family didn't know until much later in life. And when he arrived here, he came to the Utica train station and saw the beautiful Carrara marble. He said, upon arriving in New York City, we disembarked and boarded a train. Every one of us immigrants had a card attached to us that guided us to our destination. During the trip, when the train would stop, I was curious to look out and see the houses, listen to the talking, a language very different from mine. When I heard the arrival call for Utica, Utica, I cannot describe the emotions I felt at that moment. I thought I was dreaming. Instead, it was real. This sounds just like the stereotype that we think of new immigrant arriving to pursue the American dream. Of course, he then stepped out into the streets of Utica and found a reality very different than the Utica train station. He remarked that the streets were dirt, the sidewalks wood, and most of the buildings wood, and said that they, quote, showed me nothing of beauty. So he fell into a period of depression before ultimately discovering the beauty that the natural world in our region offers. This is the work Rock, Sky, and Water from the New York State Museum collection. He studied English through night school classes, continued his education, and he had a lifelong love of the library and reading and learning and being around students. He became a citizen in 1930, but he had difficulty finding work at first. The union system made it hard to get into construction work in this area, even with his years of training. He worked in a cotton mill as a house painter, and because of the work as a house painter, suffered from medical issues, which kind of retarded his process in getting work. But eventually, he was able to find work as a stonemason bricklayer. He worked on many buildings and structures at institutions that would later show his artistic work. Hamilton College, Colgate University, and even this carving in the parking lot at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute. The Utica Observer-Dispatch remarked that he, as a Utica sculptor, is a unique combination of artist and craftsman. A stonemason by occupation, he has a technical skill acquired over many years of handling the tools of his trade, which combines with a genuine depth of power of artistic conception to produce an intensely personal and valid expression. Perhaps this outstanding feature of DiSpirito's work is the sense of genuine and honest respect for his material, a gift which he shares with such great sculptors as Michelangelo. This is a drawing of Proctor Park, and that is another place that he worked as a stonemason and bricklayer, as well as My Working Shoes, another work that focuses on his hard working life. This working life was difficult for him as he started to expand as an artist. He felt that a lot of his time was taken up with work, and it was hard to focus on art as much as he wanted to. But he made a happy home here in Utica on the east side in a neighborhood with a heavy population of Italian and Syrian immigrants. He met Rose Conti, and they married on June 11, 1927, and had 3 wonderful daughters who I have gotten to know, Dolores, Teresa, and Loretta. They lived in a flat at 729 J Street and then a house at 1008 Blandina Street. And the work here out my window is a view out the apartment on J Street, looking into some of the factories that were nearby in East Utica. He felt a divide amongst himself and members of this community. He was very involved in the local community, but his working class immigrant neighbors had a very different mindset than he did as an artist. So there was kind of a duality to his life, and I think that shows up really well in this particular work showing the Mohawk Valley, the beauty of the natural world in the foreground and the far background, and then the factory life in the middle ground. In 1940, he found work in a WPA art project under the direction of Ian Clark. He was invited to join the project by his friend George Cook, and they were tasked with producing 8 dioramas focused on the local history of the region, with beeswax figures on wooden armatures, and the project took about 18 months. During this time, he felt that he needed to expand his knowledge of working in 3 dimensions. Up to this point, his artwork had really focused on 2-dimensional drawing and painting, so he enrolled at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute. But of the dioramas, these were dedicated in 1942 at the Oneida County Historical Society, and now are spread across the collections of several institutions, including the New York State Museum, and this is the one from our collection. So from 1941 to 1943, he studied at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute under Richard Davis. And when Davis learned that Henry DiSpirito was a stonemason, he encouraged him to try direct carving rather than focusing solely on modeling. This seems like an amazing epiphany for someone who's come into art from a stonemason background, but totally changed the course of his career. He continued his relationship with Davis even after he had left his studies. And Davis once commented to him, "Now about exhibiting, I would say this: if you can afford it, exhibit as much as possible. My reasons are that in showing your work and seeing your work in exhibitions with other sculpture, you will grow and improve and get valuable criticism." And he had much correspondence with DiSpirito. He did many introductions to other institutions, and Henry definitely followed this advice, exhibiting as much as possible. So this is the elephant in the New York State Museum collection. I think just a really amazing example of finding the figure that's hidden in the stone and revealing it through the use of chisels and rasps and other carving tools. He would go on to work in wood as well, using the same principles that he did in stone, revealing these figures out of the wood pieces that he was finding. In the center, Frolicking, which shows the snakes, I think is just a really amazing example to think of these branches that were found and then revealing this figure. And those are from just one branch. They're not different pieces that are assembled together. So the Munson William Proctor Art Institute, now the Munson, continued to be an important institution in his career. He first exhibited there while he was a student, and his second show there was the 10th annual exhibition of work by artists of Utica and Central New York. It was a juried show, so the jury not only chose what pieces were included, but also chose to purchase this piece for the museum collection, and it's still in their collection today. In 1950, at the 13th annual, he was chosen as one of 3 artists deserving of a one-man show, his first one that was documented. DiSpirito, through his exhibits at Munson William Proctor Art Institute, also met another figure who was really important in advancing his career and serving as a cheerleader and someone who encouraged him, and that was Paul Coonrat. Coonrat had purchased one of Henry DiSpirito's works from the Munson William Proctor Art Institute in 1952 and offered himself up as an agent for free. He himself was an author who traveled frequently, especially to New York City, and that allowed him to talk with galleries and other institutions to courier works and to really get his work out there. He wrote, "I want you to know that I am proud to be your friend, and especially proud to be a friend to your cobblestones, who are alive as you to me and part of you. What little I am doing to introduce these friends to the world of art is not work. How could it be? Really, it is joyous and thrilling each time I present them, as I feel the warmth and immediate response that comes from their new friends." And I have to say, I read this quote every time, and I feel the same way when I get to talk about it too. Paul Coonrat's gravestone in the Poland Cemetery was carved by Henry DiSpirito as well. It's hard to see with the lichen that's growing on it, but that's a book that's up at the top. The Cooperstown Art Association was another organization which he remained involved with throughout his life and career, and that was really important for getting his work out there. In 1947, the snail, which you see here, was accepted by the jury for the annual exhibition and awarded the first place in sculpture. The Utica Observer Dispatch noted, quote, "It was typical of Henry DiSpirito's use of animal subjects to express an intense concern with the basic values of humanity." His works were accepted in almost every annual exhibition of the Cooperstown Art Association between 1947 and 1985. And when his works began to be accepted into larger institutions regionally and in New York City, the fact that he felt that this show was very important and went back there year after year shows his dedication to the local art scene as well. So it's at this point that he begins to really make a break into the bigger institutions outside of Utica and really our immediate area. After tirelessly promoting his work with Coonrat's help through photos and letters of introduction, he broke into the New York City art world in 1950 and 51 with invitations to exhibit in 3 major institutions. After the battle was requested in February of 1950 for exhibition at the SculptureCenter, beginning a very long relationship there where DiSpirito's works were later included in a 3-man show and shown at the center for many years. He began a relationship with Dorothea Denslow, who was the director of the SculptureCenter, and she encouraged him to apply for grants from the National Institute of Arts and Letters, which he received in 1956. The SculptureCenter promoted his work, gave him a kind of permanent presence in New York City, even though he was not there, and he maintained a relationship with them until 1983. The lizard that you see here from 1950, which is now in the collection of the High Museum in Atlanta, was invited for exhibition at the Whitney in 1950 as part of the annual exhibition of contemporary American sculpture, watercolor, and drawings. And then in 1951, he was invited to the New Talent exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art with Irving Kreisberg and Raymond August Mintz. He exhibited the ram, the cannibal, bee, toad, grasshopper, and squirrel, and he sold half of the works that were there to Nelson and David Rockefeller. From the MoMA exhibition, they purchased grasshopper and cannibal, and those were parts of their personal collections for many years. By 1957, we know that Nelson Rockefeller also owned the ram, the bee, rabbit number 3, scarab sacri, and toad number 3, as well as the crickets. And there's a huge collection of correspondence between the two, talking about them borrowing pieces, purchasing them, where they were going to be exhibited. In a 1957 letter to Nelson Rockefeller, Henry DiSpirito wrote, "Your generous support of the arts is an asset to American culture. The tradition of the de' Medici family is still carried on." The Ant from 1952, which is now in the Fenimore Art Collection was accepted to be shown at the National Academy of Design in 1984 when Henry DiSpirito was 84 years old. The SculptureCenter had the piece on long-term exhibit and agreed to deliver it for DiSpirito, another example of how important that relationship with the SculptureCenter was to really function and get his works out there while he was not in New York City. And upstate museums were, of course, very important, and his reach began to grow at this time as well. In the Albany Institute, also in Albany, he had a two-man show with Edward Christiana. He exhibited at the Berkshire Art Association, where he received an award by juror Norman Rockwell, and he got to meet with Rockwell. He exhibited at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, the Syracuse Museum of Fine Arts, and the Roberson Memorial Center in Binghamton, the Everson Museum in Syracuse. And for many of these, in addition to participating in group shows or small group shows, getting his work into juried shows, he also participated in lending galleries and sales galleries. And this was really interesting because it is a model that you don't see in museums anymore, but it was a way for people who couldn't afford to purchase works to borrow them for a time and have them in their house. If they were having special guests and they wanted to show off the culture of the region, or they just wanted to live with the art for a while, it offered a really interesting and unique opportunity. And in addition to working with more formal lending galleries, Henry DiSpirito also did a lot of personal loans, which are documented in his papers. Sales of his works didn't make enough for him to quit working as a stonemason. And so in the 1950s, he began applying for grants to allow him more time to focus on sculpture. In 1954 and 1957, he applied to the Guggenheim Fellowship Program, but was unsuccessful both times. However, his application is very telling. He wrote, "The fellowship would relieve me of the necessity of working at my trade as a bricklayer and stonemason, and would provide me with a sustained period of direct contact with nature in the form of both subject and material. Since the start of my career as an artist, my work has been done after working hours, on Sundays and holidays. Time has literally been stolen in which to do this work, as I had to fulfill my obligations as husband and father. It is my belief that now, in the peak of my creative period, I need time to fully devote to sculpture. Not only would I use the time to create, but also to make extensive studies into animal and insect life." In 1956, he applied to the National Institute of Arts and Letters and exhibited in a show of grant application work, including his pieces, Nesting Birds, Lobster, and the Skunk, and in a show of the artists that were chosen for that fellowship. And he exhibited there the refugee, caterpillar, bumblebee, and potato bug. And I think it's really interesting, as you dig into the papers from that period, that for the National Institute of Arts and Letters in 1956, Willem de Kooning and David Smith were rejected that year. Coming back to Utica, community, despite all of these big places he was exhibiting, was really important. His adopted home was a center for him. It was a place of learning, a place of many different kinds of relationships. He wrote, "It was April of 1921, after leaving my native land, that I arrived in Utica, and from then on the city has been my home. The people, the industrial atmosphere, the scenic surroundings, and everything else pleased me greatly. The only things lacking for me were an art museum and an art school. In 1936, through the generosity of the Munson Williams Proctor's Art Institute, a new cultural program began. It was a new life for the artists of the community, and I am proud to say that I have taken part in all of the regional and local exhibitions. I am presenting my 10th annual outdoor exhibition to the general public. I pay a modest tribute to my country of adoption and to my community." His studio spaces, the places that he worked, were a very important place to connect with his local community. They were described by visitors as places of life, hospitality, and inspiration. Shortly after his marriage, when he settled into the apartment at 729 J Street in East Utica, his first workspace was a side yard with a tree as a table. And there he started these conversations between sculptor and neighbor and sculptor and children, as you see here in the photo. The J Street studio was just down the street from the John Brandigi Elementary School, and he often asked children their opinions on their way home from school and what they thought the rocks looked like. And he said that the children don't lie. Later, he did many programs for school children and lent works for exhibitions that were focused on children, often hands-on exhibitions, unlike traditional museums where you can't touch, you're allowed to touch. In the late 1940s, he moved his studio to a garage on Jefferson Avenue. It was easier to work there year-round. It was not weather dependent. The garage was acquired through community connection Alfred Landolfini, who was from nearby in Castelforte originally. So it shows again these close ties with the Italian immigrant community in East Utica. This photo is from one of his annual exhibitions that he held there. This was a space to both work and create pieces, but also to exhibit his work, and he annually would open the studio for the weekend. In 1958, the family moved to a house on Blandina Street, where he lived until the end of his life. He had a studio in the basement for working nights and during inclement weather, but also a backyard garden for display of his sculptures and as a space to work and observe nature firsthand. Henry's Garden, as it became called, was a place for friends, patrons, museum and gallery staff, locals and people from far away. Henry DiSpirito rarely traveled to his exhibition openings in New York City or further afield from central New York, but the visitors to the garden got a more complete experience of meeting the artist, viewing the sculptures in this natural habitat, and experiencing this calm oasis in the middle of an urban environment. In 1963, Henry DiSpirito was awarded an artist in residency position at Utica College of Syracuse University by Dean Sturble, and it was renewed every year until his death in 1995. This was a major life change. It was a steady paycheck and allowed him to retire as a stonemason, to focus on his art full time. It was written by Edmund Wilson in Upstate that we went to see Henry DiSpirito. I thought he was perceptibly changed. I think it has meant a lot to him to have his appointment and studio at Utica College so that he does not have to work at bricklaying anymore. He's having 2 exhibitions this summer and he has won a prize at Cooperstown. He does not have to pretend to be humble. His face seems even more remarkable than his shock of snow-white hair, more expressive in its enthusiasm and humor. It is as if his stony physique had become, with greater freedom, more flexible. His wife said that he has lately had a great burst of work. After 60, he is prodigiously productive. The studio at the college became where he worked, and Blandina Street became the place for displaying work, and many guests were documented as being invited to both places. The importance of the studio, not connected to home, he said, this is the place that tells you to do what you're here for, not for enjoyment, but you're here to create new things. When I come here, it's something different. I leave the house. The house is a place where you sleep, but when I come here, it is the place where I work to produce new things. It was also an opportunity to be around young people. He did not teach formal classes, but students were invited to drop into the studio to watch him work. He took on several students as more close mentees. He was open to working with students who were themselves open to criticism and willing to learn. He developed close relationships with students as well as faculty all the way up to the president and sculpted many of them. He contributed to the college with his time and his money, but especially with the 10 works that he donated there, plus 4 commissions. They had a profound impact on the visual character of the campus and reminded students of the heritage of the community in which they were, for many of them, visitors. In 1963, he was commissioned to create the Pioneer by Dean Sturble, and they were interested in the idea of the Pioneer, which was the symbol of the school. He worked outside in a lot on Ward Street. He chose pink granite from the Adirondacks and a boulder that he found near Syracuse. And he wrote, I tried to put him in buckskin and a coonskin cap, rifle in his hands, but I couldn't do it. I had no feeling for him that way. I saw the Pioneer as a universal symbol as well as the symbol of Utica College, and that's the way I had to make him. So we see here his vision of the Pioneer, much more hearkening to the immigrant community that was growing and striving here in Utica. And you'll also see on the left Mac created as a study for this work. Dodging the Wind was created in 1982 out of Applewood. He created it as a tribute to Utica College students. He wrote, it was a thing that I see every day. I would look out the window and see the students. carrying their books, and I was very sympathetic with them because of how the students struggled to get to school, fight the wind to get their education. He felt so strongly about education and valued the work that they were doing to be there. The Unfinished Tiger was made in 1971. He found a boulder on the campus during construction of buildings there. He saw a tiger in it, and he received permission to use it. The stone was moved to a site near the dorms where more students saw it, and they requested it to be a panther. Soon after, the administration of the school asked him to stop. There was concern over the recent Black Panther uprising, and so he stopped work. But it saddened him deeply for the rest of his life. He refused to comment on the piece, but visited it often. And in 1986, he remarked that he wished that they would move it near the library, and they did. So this is a very public work still on the campus. In 1989, Utica College of Syracuse University at that point honored him with a Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa, and really honored all of his work and time given to the students there. Utica College was not the only community institution that he worked with. He was involved with many other organizations in the surrounding area and did loans of work for special occasions and commissions. The volunteer fireman from 1970 for the Deerfield Fire Company is one example. For this one, they wanted to commission him, and he chose to work as a volunteer sculptor, just as they were volunteer firemen. He also worked frequently with the blind and visually impaired communities. The Rehabilitation Center for the Blind in Topeka, Kansas, approached DiSpirito about buying a piece. He sent a rabbit statue with the stipulation that it must be returned if it didn't meet their needs. And of course, they commented that it certainly did. They wrote back, "Besides the sheer enjoyment of the object through manual observation of it, all of us, the sighted and the blind, continue to wonder about the man who can see inside rocks. What kind of person is he, and what does he tell us through his art?" DiSpirito's works were included in an exhibition called Beauty for the Sighted and Blind in 1959, where objects were used with the blind and visually impaired communities so that they could touch the works and have appreciation for them even if they couldn't see them. In 1962, he exhibited in an exhibition in Pennsylvania where both the visually impaired communities and children were invited and encouraged to touch the works. And in 1992, he exhibited at the Central Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired here in Utica, and the Foundation Gallery at Herkimer Community College. And again, those were hands-on exhibitions where the visitors were invited to touch the works and engage with them in a totally different way than when we typically think of museum shows. The works that you get to see today that are here in the collection are portraits of Henry DiSpirito by other artists in the community. So I encourage you to check those out. But I think these are just a real testament to the community that the different levels of community that he connected with here in Utica. He did work with a lot of other artists. They exhibited together, especially his friends who worked in two-dimensional medias. They often collaborated to put together shows that were two-dimensional and three-dimensional and really make use of both media together. Eugene Nasser, his friend, wrote on DiSpirito and other individuals in Utica who inspired children of working-class families here. He said, "Henry's example was the most telling of all. The immigrant stonemason with his toolbox, who after a life of work much like that of our fathers, turned late in life to the call of his soul to art." And the chair that you see there is from his studio space, his jacket from his adventures out into the natural world to find inspiration, and stones. Those are both in the collection of the New York State Museum. So finally, I want to, as I mentioned, invite you to come to Albany to the New York State Museum. This is just a little snippet of our exhibition that is there. You can probably tell that we were inspired by Henry's garden and wanted to create, although inside in the middle of the city, an environment that harkened back to that experience of seeing the sculptures in the garden. I also want to thank again his daughters, Dolores, Teresa, and Loretta, for their many, many years of tireless work to preserve the legacy of their father, of his community connections, and those of his friends, his other artist friends who worked here in the community. And you can see the book there, the photograph of us is at the book signing when it first came out in 2013. So I will be happy to take any questions.